Circuit automation. In today's session, we will see about state transition technique. It is also one of the test case design technique used. So far we have seen boundary value analysis, equivalence class partitioning, decision table in our last session. In today's session, we will focus on state transition technique. So state transition testing is a black box testing technique used to design the test cases based on states that a system can be in and the transition between those states. It is particularly useful for testing the systems where different inputs or events can cause a change in state of the application. In this, tester can provide positive as well as negative input to a system to check the behavior of application. So, the scenarios where after giving a certain input the state of the application changes, in such scenario we can use the state transition technique. So we will see one example where we can understand in better way when to use the state transition technique. So when there is a sequence of events that occur in the application under test. For example, let's take example of a login page of any banking application. So there can be some event of inputs. For example, after 3 attempts of incorrect password or incorrect username, it should block that specific account. So for example, let's say there is a user who is doing the first time login. In the first attempt, he enters the correct username and correct password, then he should be login. If in the first attempt he enters incorrect password, then we should allow the second attempt. In second attempt, if he allows the incorrect password, if he enters the incorrect password again, then again it should allow for third attempt. But even if in the third attempt, if user enters incorrect credentials, then it should block the user for entering or retrying the login again. So 3 attempt is the maximum. After 3 attempt, that account should get blocked and user should not be able to even input the username and password. So that these are basically a state change depending on the input. If the inputs are correct, if both the input are correct, then it should log in the system. That is the first state transition. Correct input, it should go to home page. That means after login, it should go to login page. If user is entering incorrect input, then what it should display? It should display some error message for first attempt. For second wrong attempt, again it should show some error message. For third wrong attempt, it should show account block message. That is a different state again. So this is basically a sequence of events that can happen with the inputs. In such situation, we can use a state transition technique. So whenever a software application can be defined by a finite number of state or input values, we can use the state transition technique. Also, wherever testing the user interface, so user interface where it is taking a different form depending on the input. It can be a number of attempts or it can be a certain type of test input where the user interface changes. So that is basically transition of the state. So it can be a different screen for different type of test input, or after input the certain test input with the sequence of certain test input, the screen might change. That is basically a transition of the state. So in such situation where web application can have different state such as login, logout, adding a cart, checkout, etc. So these are the state transition testing. Also, in this state transition testing, we can test these test states to make sure that the application behaves as intended. So during such transition of different states depending on the test inputs, we should always verify that this transition of the state is correctly working as per the expectation. For example, whenever testing mobile applications to test online offline state, workflows, etc. What are the steps to perform the state transition testing? So what are the steps we should keep in our mind while doing the state transition testing? First step is we have to identify the states. What are the different state that can happen with the different test input that we have to identify? We have to determine all the possible states that system can be in. Then we have to identify the transitions. We have to identify all the possible transitions between the states, including the events or any specific conditions that trigger that. So every state can be triggered by some specific condition. And then we have to create a state transition diagram. So we will see in example also, then we can understand in better manner. But just let's go through these points first and then we will see one example. So we have to create the state transition diagram that represent the states and transitions in a diagram or a table. And then we have to design the test cases according to that state transition diagram or table. That scenarios will cover all possible transitions including valid as well as invalid transitions. And then we can execute those test cases and verify the system behavior whether it is working as expected or not. Now let's see one example for such scenario. So this is basically a state transition diagram. So it is the same example which we have explained earlier. So let's consider a login screen. Let's say login screen of some banking application. In that login screen, if the user enters 3 times incorrect password or username, so whenever on the third attempt, so if the user enters correct inputs, that means correct username and correct password in the first attempt, then we should allow that successful login. If he enters incorrect in the first attempt, then we should allow for the second try. And even if in second try, if the user enters incorrect credentials or incorrect password, then we should block that account. Now these are the scenarios. Now we have to define the state transition diagram. So if you see, these boxes are basically different type of states. So what is the first step? We have to identify the states. We have to determine all possible states that the system can be in. So first state will be starting. So start will be S1. S1 means state 1. So user has opened the login screen. User has opened the login screen where he can put his PIN code or password. So we have the application where user have to enter some PIN code. Let's say we have the banking application where user have to enter some PIN code. So first state will be starting point. So start point is the S1. S1 means start. And from that starting screen, if user enters correct PIN, if you see in the first try is again another state. So if the user enters the correct PIN, then it should grant the access. User should be successfully logged in. It should grant the access to the user. So now state is changed. If you see, initial state was S1, that is starting state. State 2 is entering the correct PIN. After entering the correct PIN, the state will change. Access will be granted. So user will come on the state 5 here. This is the state 5. If in the first try, now let's say in the first try, if user enters incorrect PIN, then we will give the second try to user. Again the state is changed. If you see, after first try, what is the action? Incorrect PIN. After the first try, if user enters incorrect PIN, then we will give the user option to enter again. That means it is a second try. It is another state now. In the second state, what are the two possibilities? In the second attempt, user can either enter correct PIN. If user enters the correct PIN, then again access should be granted. Or if the user enters the incorrect PIN in second try as well, then it will go to third state. It will go to state 4 here. That is the third try. we will ask the user to enter one more time. That is the last attempt now, third try attempt. So this is the third attempt for user. Again, two possibilities on the third attempt. So in this state, there are two actions. Either user will enter correct pin or the user will again enter incorrect pin. If the user enters the correct pin, then again access will be granted. And if the user enters incorrect pin, now what is the state? Now the new state is account blocked. If in the third try, if user enters incorrect pin again, then it will go to account block state. So each box is basically one state. So if you name this start as S1, first try as S2, second try as S3, third attempt as S4, fifth, that is access granted state, is S5, and account blocked is S6. If you see, so to create the state transition table, we have to first, in one column, we have to first note down all the states here. Starting state is S1, first attempt is S2, second attempt is S3, third attempt is S4, fifth attempt, not the fifth attempt, after third attempt, either it can be access granted if the correct pin, that is S5, or it can be account block if incorrect pin in third attempt, that is the S6 state. Now depending on this state, there is some action. So for every state, there is some action which user is taking. Now what are the two type of actions? So if you see the steps, we have to identify the states. Now we have identified the states. So these are all states basically, S1, S2, S3, S4, S5, 6. These 6 are basically a state of the application. Then we have to identify the transitions. So we have to identify the transitions that include certain triggers or events that will trigger that specific transition. So in this scenario, what is the transition state, or what is the event? What triggers the change in the state? Right, so entering the pin, right? So if user enters correct pin, or user can enter incorrect pin. So these are the inputs, or these are the actions which will trigger the state change. For example, if in the first step, that is starting state, on the starting first try, if user enters correct pin, let's say on this state, if the user enters correct pin, it will go to which state? S5. If correct pin is entered, then access will be granted. So if you see, for starting point, first attempt, if user enters the correct pin, if you see correct pin, then it should go to state 5, right? Correct pin will go to state 5. If user enters incorrect pin, then what will happen? So if you see, for correct pin, it will go to S5. If incorrect pin in first attempt, then it will go to state 2. If user has attempted incorrect attempt, then it will go to first try, right? So in the first attempt, again in the first attempt, if user enters the correct one, then the access will be granted. And if user enters the incorrect, right? So if the user enters incorrect, then he will go to second try, that is S3, that is second try means state 3 here. In the second attempt, let's say in the second attempt, if user enters correct pin, then he will go to S5, because if second attempt, if user enters correct pin, he will go to access granted state, S5 state. But if he enters the incorrect pin, then again he will go to state 4, that is last attempt, third retry attempt. So now the state will be here. Even in the third attempt, if user enters correct pin, that is the action here, correct pin, then it will go to S5, access will be granted. If user enters incorrect pin, then it will go to S6, because now this is account blocked state. And access granted and account blocked, for those there are no state transitions, because after that there is no action. Either it can be access granted, this is the end point, or it can be account blocked. So this is basically how the state transition table will look. from the starting point, if user enters the correct pin, then it will go to access granted. In the first try only, if user enters the correct, then it will go to S5. And if incorrect pin is entered, then it will go to first try option, and so on. So basically this is how the state transition table looks. So we have to first identify the states, then we have to identify the transitions, then we have to create the state transition diagram, or we can say a state transition table. Then we have to design the test cases. According to that, we can design the test cases as well. So these are basically will give you the test cases for various type of states. So every state transition is kind of a one test case. Every test transition is one test case. So we have to check for correct pin on the first try. If you see, we have to check the correct pin transition for the first try. We have to check incorrect pin for the first try as well, so that it will go to second try option. Then we have to enter the correct pin after the second try, it will go to access granted. We have to check for incorrect pin after the second try, that will go to third try option. That is another test case. In the third try, again we have to check for the correct pin, then access will be granted. And in the third try, we have to check for incorrect pin, where account will be blocked. So these are all the test cases. We can derive the test cases from this state transition diagram. Every flow is basically one test case. So this is about the state transition table. So states, that software can be represented by rectangle with rounded corners. If you see, all the rounded corners, or we can say rectangles, these are basically different states of the software where it can be present. That is a specific state depending on the condition. A state is a situation or condition of a system. It is represented by a node basically. In a state transition diagram, there are nodes. So every state is a one node. Every state is one node. Each node represents a different state of the system. Every node is basically a different state of the system. And we have to do transition from one state to another. So represented by arrows. So these arrows are nothing but transition from one state to another state. A transition is a change in the state of a system that occurs when it responds to the event. What is the event here? Entering the correct pin, that is the event. Entering the incorrect pin, that is also an event. So whenever event happens, the state changes. If you see, after the first try, correct pin, this is the event, state changed. Incorrect pin, this is the event, state will change. Again, so all the events will change the state of the application. And every state is different. Then we have to label above the applicable transition arrow. So events that result in transitions. So if you see on the arrow, we have to place the event. So this arrow is a transition, and this on this arrow we have to mention the event which does that transition. Our event is an action or occurrence that triggers the change in the state of a system. So event is basically action which changes the state. For example, after the first try is a state, correct pin is an event, the transition has happened, and the state is changed. So this is how end-to-end state transition diagram is displayed. And we can consider or derive the test cases from this state transition diagram. So this is about the state transition table and state transition diagram technique. This is also one of the test design technique which is used to design the test cases in such situations where, depending on the trigger inputs, the state is changing. Right? So in such situation, we have to do state transition technique. So thank you for watching this video. In coming session, what we will see? In coming session, we will see the last one, that is error guessing technique. What is error guessing test design technique? That we will see in coming session. Thank you for watching this.